Okay, so I'm Professor Glenn Hyndes from Edith, Cowan University. I never really thought when I was going through school that I would be a professor in coastal ecology, but there you go. Certainly pathways took me here, and when I was growing up, I didn't really know what a marine biologist was. I really had no idea. I spent a lot of time around the coast and on the water, but I never really thought of it as being a career until I started my degree in biology, because there wasn't really a degree in marine biology at that stage. And it was really during that degree that I got really interested in the marine side of things. And eventually, when I finished my degree, I did honours, and then I went on and worked for a little while, and then I did my PhD, and then I did a couple of postdocs, and then ended up teaching at Edith Cowan University, which has been a really rewarding experience. So it's yeah, unexpected. I certainly didn't expect it when I was your age. And my daughter now is actually doing marine studies at another school, because I live south of the river. So the task that I've been given today is to talk about interdependence of organisms, and that's a really broad task, a really broad topic. So what I've done is actually separate it or narrow it down to those interdependence of organisms or species rather, and I'm going to discuss that as the main sort of thread for my talk today. And a lot of it really is focused around food, which is something I'm always thinking about, and habitat, or what we consider to be sort of houses and so on. So it's a real balance between the two. So I'm going to talk about interspecies interactions. I'm first of all going to talk about competition, although that's not necessarily dependence of organisms on each other, but it's something that we really need to be thinking about in terms of interactions. And then facilitation, symbiosis, talk about habitat, and then really a lot of the talk will be actually about foods and food webs. And I'm going to end that with bringing in a case study, which I think you'd be interested in on loggerhead turtles and predation on eggs and hatchlings, and then come back at the end and talk about seascape processes. So competition is the conflict over resources between and within species. So particularly what I'm interested in is the competition between species, and that's usually a competition for both habitat and food. And this can really affect the abundances of different species, and one species is often more dominant than other species and will actually be able to encroach on the space, on the resources that one species is having or is utilising. And so what that will do is actually compress the spatial distribution of that less dominant species. And that's sort of shown in this figure in the bottom right-hand corner here. We've got a couple of species of barnacles, and the balana species is the dominant, and actually then compresses the distribution of the other species upwards and away from the waterline. So that has a big impact on the actual distribution of the species, and therefore the food and the habitat availability. But now we're moving on to really those interactions between different biota or different species. And facilitation is a process that's or part of a process known as succession. And this is where one species sets up an environment that is suitable for another species to come in and settle in and actually take over. And you see this on hard substrates when you create a new reef, for example, or there might be a space in a seagrass meadow like shown here that has become available through blowouts because of anchors from boats, or that might be overgrazing. But what this example here shows is that where there have been spaces in the seagrasses, there's recruitment of these seaweed species. Hopefully you can see my cursor here. And so these seaweed species settle into this bare sediment, and then they create an environment that is actually more suitable for other species to come in. So they stabilise the sediment, They actually reduce the amount of the loss of nutrients. And so then you get seagrass species coming in like Halidule and Sargasso. And they're pioneer species of seagrasses. They come in and they establish the sediment even further for these other species like this glacier grass coming in at a later date. So you've got this successional process of different species coming in and really setting up the framework for other species to come in and actually overtake that space. And symbiosis is probably one of the main sets of mechanisms by which you have interactions between organisms or interdependence among organisms. And I guess that the coral trout, the corals, and their relationship with zooxanthellae is probably one of the most well known of those, where the zooxanthellae live inside the coral polyps. And so the coral polyp is actually providing a habitat for these zooxanthellae to live in. And of course, they then provide nutrients to the corals. And so they exude what are called dissolved organic molecules. And the corals are able to actually utilize those molecules as food. And of course, corals also rely on their heterotrophic organisms as well. So they rely on other things coming in and actually attaching to their tentacles. Different corals rely on that external source of nutrients in different ways. So that's called mutualism. So both parties in this case actually have a benefit out of that relationship. But then you have something like that's called commensalism, where only one of them actually gets a real benefit out of it, and the other there's just no benefit. There's not a negative effect, but there's no benefit. And this example here that I show in this photo is an example of that, where you've got juvenile fish that are actually utilizing the space in a jellyfish as habitat. The jellyfish doesn't gain anything from this, but it doesn't get harmed by it. But the fish actually get a habitat to be able to get some protection from predation. Then you've got parasitism, where an organism actually has a negative impact on its host, and the host actually has been affected detrimentally. So in this case, you can just see a sea lice inside the mouth of the anemone fish, and effectively that sea louse is going to just suck on the blood or take flesh from the tongue and the mouth of that anemone fish. But then those fish often also have a mutualistic relationship with other types of fish. So we see the cleaning wrens there in the bottom photo there, where the cleaning wrens come along and they actually peck out the sea lice from the mouths of these fish. And there are often stations set up around coral reef systems where these fish come into, and the cleaner wrens come along and they just clean the fish, which is pretty cool. And then there's predation. We often don't think of predation as being a symbiotic relationship, but it is considered to be one. In this case, there's a negative effect on the host, on the prey rather. So in this case, I've got a photo of a sea otter where it's actually feeding on urchins, and I'll come back and talk about this as an example later on. Obviously, it's a negative effect on the urchins, but it's a positive effect on the sea otters. So they've got food, and that allows them to grow and reproduce themselves. Habitat is probably one of the main interactions that biota have with other biota or other species, and they're called biogenic habitat. So biogenic, what I mean by biogenic habitat is it's a habitat that's created by another living organism. Seagrass is a good example of that. Kelp, as shown here on the right-hand side, is another example, and of course coral is another example as well. And so that's quite different to other types of habitats, which are just physical habitats made of physical properties. So like sand, we've got a bare sand habitat on the very left-hand side there. And just a show of hands, who can actually see a fish in that photo? Yeah, it's pretty hard to see though, isn't it? It's you can actually see a flounder just, and the camouflage there is really effective at actually allowing that species to really hide from predation, and sometimes they even hide in the sediment with just their eyes popping out. But the habitats, the seagrass habitats and kelp habitats and also corals provide a really important habitat for a whole range of species. But one habitat is not necessarily the same as another habitat, and this is an example that I brought in from a project that I did way back in the late 90s, where we're looking at the fish communities in different seagrass habitats just off the coast of Fremantle. There are a range of different seagrass habitats which are really important for fish species. We've got Amphipods griffithii, which is that one on the very left-hand side, and that has like a canopy sort of structure to it, compared to Posidonia sinuosa, which is much more of a strap-like leaf seagrass, and then you've got Posidonia coriacea, which is much more sparse as a habitat. They all have very, very different fish communities, as represented by these ellipses up here. There's a little bit of overlap, but a lot of the species are actually really focusing on one particular habitat. And so there are different interactions between different seagrass species and fish. So we've got the rainbow kale and sea trumpeter in the Amphipolis compared to the soldier fish, or it's also called a happy moment, which is sort of a really weird name. And it's called happy moment because it gives you a nasty sting when you actually get spined by it, and it's really, really painful. And you have the spotted pipefish. In the Posidonia coriacea, you have the striped pipefish, and then the bane of many fishers' lives is the blowfish. And then if you go into bare sand, then you have a different species of sweet again. And this one's an example of a flathead sandfish. So habitat matters. So now talking about trophic or food as an interaction, which is probably the biggest process of interdependence between or among different species of marine life. So we think about a food web. It's made up of a range of different what we call trophic levels. So you've got the primary producers, the plants, down to the bottom, that's the first trophic level. Then you've got the primary consumer, so that's the herbivore, comes in and actually eats the primary producer. That's the second level, and you would have already had some of the content of this in your classes, I'm sure. And then your secondary consumers going through to your carnivore, and then you have multiple levels after that, depending on how high you go up, which could go up to something like the white shark, which is a top order predator. And that then provides you with a food chain that is essentially like this. You've got the primary producers going up to herbivores, and then going up to multiple levels of carnivores. But it's not that simple, because food webs can be quite complex. You have simple food webs in the open ocean, where you're just relying on phytoplankton, and you're getting a feed up of nutrients going from phytoplankton upwards. But as you go into more coastal systems, or systems with more habitats and benthic systems, then it becomes a little bit more complex. So here we've got an example of, say, phytoplankton, which is this is an Antarctic food web. You've got phytoplankton, and that's krill are feeding on phytoplankton, and then you've got other plankton that's actually herbivores feeding on the phytoplankton as well. Then you've got carnivorous plankton. But because the krill is not just feeding on plankton, it's feeding on not just phytoplankton, sorry, it's feeding on other plankton as well. So the carnivorous plankton and the herbivorous plankton. And then they are fed on by fish, and then birds can also feed on fish, and squid can feed on fish. So you've got this interaction between organisms within the same trophic level. So that makes it much, much more complicated to be able to actually look at the interactions between those species. And then, of course, you've got something like the leopard seals, which I think are probably about the scariest seals I've ever come across. They feed on the fish and the birds, and of course the squid. So they feed on a multiple range of different organisms, but all in the same trophic level. And then you have things like the orca whale, the orcas coming in and feeding on leopard seals and elephant seals and so on. But just to complicate it, you've got these massive animals called humpback whales that just completely bypass all of these carnivorous trophic levels, consumer trophic levels, and just go right down to the krill. So you get these massive, massive animals that are actually feeding on these tiny little animals that are called krill, but they eat them in such massive quantities that they're able to sustain themselves. And as I said before, the more complex the habitats and ecosystems, then the more complex the food web. And I'm not going to go into detail on this one, but you can see here that this is a representation of the food web on the south coast of Australia. And you've got a whole range of different arrows going all over the place. So you've got algae, which is being consumed by abalone and urchins. And then you've got that material that is then actually flowing onto the beaches and being decomposed, and that's being fed on by crabs and also by sea cucumbers. And then you're going up the food chain, ultimately to bronze whalers and port jacks and sharks, and then, of course, ultimately to us. So very, very complex because there's a whole bunch of macroalgae that forms on reefs. This also doesn't include seagrass, which is a major primary producer in that sort of southern part of Australia. So predators are probably the ones, the trophic level that we probably hear most about because, well, we're probably most interested in them. And we also eat mostly predators in terms of fish as well. So when I'm talking about predators, I'm talking about, an organism that is actually consuming prey, and that's another organism. Now, a predator can also be a herbivore. We can think of herbivores being predators as well, but often when we're thinking about predators, we think about something that's actually feeding on other animals. So predators are able to regulate their prey population, so they can keep the populations relatively low, and that's one of the jobs of the predators, is to ensure that there's a balance in the ecosystem so that the prey populations are not overexpanding. And of course, the prey can actually regulate the predators as well. So if you've got a low number of prey and that predator is relying on only one or two species of prey, then the smaller the population of prey, then that will have a negative effect on the actual predator. So you've got this sort of feedback mechanism where you can have boom and bust of prey, and that can have an effect on the predator as well. And then you have what's called keystone predators. So these are predators that have a disproportionate effect on the prey and the ecosystem below them. And one such keystone predator is the orca. And I'll come back and I'll talk about the orca's role. We can see in this right-hand graph over here, which was based on some work that was done way back in the late 90s, but it's a classic ecological piece of work, where we can see on the left-hand side of that graph, we've got high populations of sea otters in the 1970s and 80s. And because one of their main food sources is the urchin, then they're actually maintaining the population of urchins. And that means that the urchins are then having a little effect on their main food source, which is the kelp, across that system, across the west coast of USA and Canada. But what happened was that the population of otters actually decreased in the 1990s. And that meant that with the smaller number of otters, sea otters, then that led to a decrease in the predation on the urchins, which meant that there was actually an increase in their population, and then there was an increase in grazing intensity on the kelp because that was their main food source. And that led to an overgrazing of the kelp and ultimately to major what are called kelp barrens. And so you just had these masses of urchins over these very, very bare areas. Now, what they think is the cause of that was the actual increase in the number of orcas coming into the coastal regions, and they think that was associated with the cessation of the whaling industry. So the orcas relied on the whaling industry and getting scraps and so on from the whaling industry, And of course, when the whaling industry actually stopped, then the orcas had to find food from elsewhere and moved into the coastal systems. So one of the, I guess you could think about it as one of the negative effects of conservation movements, but obviously we needed to cut back on the whaling operations. Herbivores are also really important. So we've got herbivores that are feeding on plants. As I said before, they can also be considered as predators. They play a major role in keeping many primary producers down. You've got dugongs that feed on seagrasses, and that's a massive form of food to the dugongs up in Shark Bay and up north. But you've also got species of herbivores that live in coral reefs, and they rely on the coral reefs for protection from predation. But then they come out from the coral reef and then move into the seaweed areas. And I'll show you. You can see here on this graph in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the amount of algal canopy as you move further away from the reef. So the canopy actually increases the further away from the reef you go. And that's because the herbivores are mainly living in the coral reef, and they come out from the coral reef, feed on the algae, and then shoot back into the reef for protection from predation. And that then causes, if you look up at this this photograph here, of what are called halos, where the herbivores come out only a little way from the reef and actually then feed on the algae and then go back into the reef and where they're getting protection from predation. But what that does is allows for the reef to continue to grow, because if you had all of this algae growing in and next to the reef, then that would cut the light out and prevent any growth and any sustainability of the coral reefs. One of the things that we don't really hear a lot about when we hear about food webs is omnivory. When I'm talking about omnivory, it's those animals that actually feed on both animals and plants. And that's actually far more common in vegetated systems than not. And the western rock lobster is a classic example of an omnivore, where it actually lives in the reef and hides in the reef during the day, and then it comes out at night time when it's actually got less predation pressure on it. But its diet is really, really varied. So if you look on the left-hand side here, then these are the results of gut content analyses, where they've got they're feeding predominantly on algae and with some crustaceans and mollusks and so on being consumed as well. And a technique that's called stable isotopes also indicates this. I'm not going to go into the details of stable isotopes, but what it does show is what the animals are actually feeding on. And so that's actually showing here that there's a whole bunch of different food items that the western rock lobster are feeding on. But it varies between different habitats. So in seagrass habitat, then they're less reliant on articulated coralline algae. We can see here on the right-hand side in this bottom left right-hand side graph, and invertebrates and so on actually provide a large part of their food source, plus also the macroalgae. Whereas on the actual macroalgal and sand habitats, the articulated coralline algae actually play a slightly bigger role. And interestingly, bait plays a big role in their nutritional intake on some of those areas as well. But they're feeding on a whole range of different food sources. And then I wanted to really just show as a case study how complex food webs are. And I think the ghost crab actually provides a classic example of this, and how opportunistic some species can be, and so how they can rely on a whole range of different species to maintain their populations. And I'm going to use ghost crabs up in the Ningaloo coast as an example here. A student of mine a PhD student of mine has just recently finished, and he did this fantastic report at Ningaloo showing the predation levels on the eggs and the hatchlings of the loggerhead turtles. So dietary analysis, so where you cut open the guts of the crabs and you look at the material, and there are two species of crabs that are the main consumers on the beaches up in Ningaloo. You've got the golden ghost crab, which is this one in the centre here, and then you've got the horned ghost crab, down the bottom. The golden ghost crab feeds through gut content, so it shows that it's actually feeding mostly on algae, with a little bit of other material as well. Whereas the horned ghost crab is feeding on insects and forams and so on. So a completely different diet for the two species that are actually living on the same beach. So the golden ghost crab actually feeds on a lot of animal material and fish and a whole range of different things, and that's shown by DNA analysis. So often what happens with gut content analysis is that there's a lot of mush in it, so you can't necessarily see the material that gets digested really quickly. So DNA analysis of the gut contents allows us to be able to see what is actually in the guts that we can't normally see through gut content analysis. And what that showed for the golden ghost crab was that they're feeding on turtle eggs and hatchlings. They're also feeding on fish, which is what this Actinopteri is. They're feeding on birds, rats as well, and that's because they're scavengers, and so they're going to be feeding on just dead birds or dead fish or rats that are found on the beach or in the dunes. And if you look at stable isotope analysis again, then it shows that before the nesting season, then these golden ghost crabs are actually predominantly getting food source from fish, but also from a range of other other sources as well, including algae, which you can see here. This is the Sargasso, which is an alga. But come the nesting season, so this is the time when there are actually eggs in the nests on the beach, then turtle eggs become a much larger part of their diet. And then in February, which is when the turtle hatchlings are actually emerging, then the hatchlings become a major part of their diet. So they're really relying on turtle hatchlings and eggs during that nesting season. And some experiments, I'm not going to go into detail here about this one because we've probably really got the time for that. But the turtle hatchlings or fish, in some experiments, we showed that fish was their main preference, but they also had a preference for hatchlings when they weren't given, or not preference, but they also consumed large quantities of hatchlings when they were given the choice of feeding on hatchlings. So Casper, my PhD student, went in and he did some nest inventories. So he came in and counted the eggs before, just as the female was laying them, and then came back after the end of the nesting season or the incubation period and counted the eggs afterwards, which was a pretty smelly job because he was picking out eggs out of the nest or decomposing, and it's quite a disgusting job, but it's really interesting results that have come out. We've got here at the end of the nesting season or the incubation season shows that nearly 40% of the eggs at Bungalup Beach and 80% of the eggs at Nalu were missing, and these missing eggs can be put down to predation. And so and I'll show you some video in a short while how the ghost crabs are likely to be the main predator there. And then the hatchlings actually emerge, and at Bungalup they did actually emerge, and so we had crabs as being the main form of predator on the hatchlings, and I'll show you some video footage of that in a short while. And around about 50% of the hatchlings that emerged actually made it safely to the sea. Whereas at Nalu Bay, we didn't see any hatchlings actually emerging, which is presumably because most of the eggs have actually been predated on. So the main predators were the golden ghost crab. The silver gull was also a major predator, and sometimes it even stole the hatchlings off of the golden ghost crab. And they had rats coming in occasionally, and also the goannas. And you can actually see here in this right-hand corner, you can see the actual hatchlings emerging out of the nest. So let's look at the impact that the golden ghost crab can have on a nest. So you can see here, and this is sped up because we're dealing with, a long period of time over the night and during the morning time. When you're seeing the golden ghost crabs are actually burrowing in on top of the nest, and they're going into the nest and actually consuming the eggs. So it's a massive amount of predation that's taking place, and that was probably an extreme case there. Now, if we look at this video, then we can see we've got the two species of ghost crabs here, golden ghost crabs here, got the horned ghost crab here, and you'll start to see around here some hatchlings starting to emerge. There you go, you just grabbed one. That one's just looking at another one and grabbed it. Oh, it's escaped, and it grabs it again. And then you'll start to see that there are many more starting to emerge out of here. And so these guys are now trying to make their way to the ocean. And eventually, in the not too distant future, they're going to be swamped on by a whole bunch of seagulls. Here we go. So you can see here that there's this mass emergence. And wait for it, wait for it. There you go. So there's a huge amount of predation. Look at that, just bang, bang, bang. So I don't think any of the, in this particular occasion, I don't think any of the hatchlings actually made it to the water, but some do. So if we look at it in terms of the energy, then most of the energy from the nest, from the eggs, actually goes to the predators, the ghost crabs, and then also the gulls and the goannas, and then they're fed on by, well, at least we think, by dingoes, goannas, and then also when the crabs make their way down to the water by rays. But then there's also the decomposing eggs actually provide nutrients for a whole range of decomposers. So only around about 10% of that energy, or 8% of that energy, actually makes it back into the water as hatchlings. So it's a very, very small proportion up at Ningaloo Reef, which is a bit of a concern. Now, how am I going for time?
You've got probably like 10 minutes and then a bit of time for questions.
Okay, so this will only take 5 minutes, I think. What I wanted to get across here was just, again, the complexity about the interactions between organisms and the dependence on it. And in these seascape, what we call seascapes, which is like just off the coast here, you've got a whole range of different ecosystems, like you've got reef systems, you've got seagrass meadows, you've got unvegetated areas, and of course you've got the coastline, which has got beaches and surf zones. Material from the reefs and from the seagrass meadows gets uprooted, particularly during the winter period, and then can make its way across to the shore and make its way onto the beach. And many of you would have seen the amount of kelp and seagrass that accumulates on the beaches. And that happens around the world. We've got examples here. So this is South Africa. A is South Africa. B is Chile. C is in the Mediterranean, and D, you should be very familiar with this because this is just down the road from you guys at Hillary's, where you get large amounts of wrack onto the beach. So that has strong interaction with the organisms in the surf zone area. So amphipods in the surf zone rely on the wrack that comes in. So you can see here, this graph here shows that with an increase in the amount of wrack on the beaches, then there's actually an increase in the abundance of these amphipods here, which are they're small crustaceans, so not that dissimilar, I guess, to shrimp. And that's really reliant on this material here coming into the shore. And then, of course, you get fish relying not just on the abundance of the biomass of the wrack, but they're also feeding, the juveniles are feeding on these amphipods. So there's a really strong reliance on this material that's transported in through connection processes that allow those systems to be really, really productive. And many of those species actually do rely on different types of food sources as well. But the big food source that's really important in these habitats is kelp. So I don't have a clonia, which is the kelp that we find off the coast here, but we have Davillia and Egregia, which are two that occur much more diversely in the world. So a lot of the amphipods actually really rely on kelp as it comes into the beaches, and seagrass comes in too, but that forms more of a habitat. So there's this real strong dependency of these animals on that kelp material coming in. And then just to add another layer of complexity, there are bacteria on this decomposing material, and what we're finding is that bacteria plays a big role in the productivity of those amphipods. So you can see here's an amphipod. You can actually see, if you look really closely, there's an amphipod on the kelp here, and these holes in the kelp are actually created by the amphipods. So this is a species of Ecology which we find off the coast here. So what we showed is that there are a large amount of bacteria on the kelp, and we also applied antibiotics to the kelp to actually reduce the amount of bacteria. So where there was bacteria on the kelp, then that actually increased the growth of both the females and the males of the amphipods on both fresh and aged kelp. And it also increased the proportion of ovigerous, so they're the reproductively active females. And so even though the number of eggs didn't necessarily differ per female, then with the number of, or the proportion of females being higher where there's bacteria, indicates that the bacteria plays a major role in the productivity of those amphipods. So it's not just the kelp itself, it's the bacteria, or what we call the biofilm, that's present on that kelp that's important as well. So hopefully from this, I've shown you that there's a strong interdependence of biota in the marine environment through nutrients to some degree, but mainly food and habitat. And that fauna respond to different types of habitats. The structure is really important, and other resources provided by the habitat. And of course, food webs are generally really complex, and much more complex than we often give them credit for. And that really depends on the drivers of the habitat services, so structure and the sources of the primary production. Omnivory is a really common form of consumption by consumers, particularly in vegetated habitats. And there can be a real strong mixing between omnivory and scavenging and predation, as I showed with the ghost crab. And so that means that they are less reliant on just one food source. And so their populations can be maintained, even if, say, the population of, say, sea turtles actually diminished. And then there are seascape processes that make those interactions even much more complex. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Just before I get someone to ask a question, I personally wanted to say that the context you used with the golden ghost crabs and the loggerhead turtles, I couldn't have been more interested, because that was my master's thesis, was studying sex ratios of the eggs. Yeah, so when you were talking about that, I had always wondered how much the golden ghost crabs were affecting, and I was at Nalu as well, so I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Poor Elise is traumatized. I'll have to tell her how many baby turtles I had to dissect as part of my thesis. She'll probably never talk to me again. But even when you were talking about the orcas in that sea urchin example, we were talking about that last week, and we didn't really understand what it was that made them come. So it was really good that you mentioned about the reducing in whaling and then that causing a bit of displacement there. So thank you, that was really good. Anyone have any questions over here? I think James might be the only one. It was really comprehensive. Can you come up here, James?
Yep. So do you find it a lot easier to undertake studies now than compared to the 90s, like with all the new technology available?
That's an interesting question, James. Thanks for the question. Yes and no, the answer is to that, because technology certainly allows us to be able to do things much easier. Videography is just changes the way that we look at things, and really allows us to be able to get out and see things that we wouldn't have seen back in the 90s. I guess the thing that is more difficult is the processes around actually getting out and doing the work, because there are a lot more, there's much higher safety standards and also ethical standards around the research now. So we have to go through a lot more processes to be able to do that. And often, you know, we need to have much more training in terms of being able to drive vessels, being able to actually dive. So now to dive, you have to have a scientific diver's permit to be able to do that, or certificate. You have to have a coxswain certificate to be able to actually drive a pilot a vessel. So the whole range of different things sort of make it harder, but at the same time, you've got this technology that makes it much easier as well. And you can actually start to answer some really interesting sort of questions with the technology. So yeah, so in many ways it has really helped.
Yeah.
Any, do you want me to expand on that anymore, or?
Oh, no, I think you did it quite comprehensively, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good answer. I thought that might be what you'd say. Have you actually met a leopard seal? Have you actually come across one?
No, I haven't, but geez, the video footage
They are
I see
terrifying.
yeah, they are
Yeah.
terrifying.
I know.
Yeah, I wish I would love to come across one from a bit of a distance, but
Yeah,